"You're not a guest, Marable. You're the helping hand," my mother sneered, her voice cutting through the humid air of the sunroom like a jagged blade. Before I could even process the words, she tossed a stiff, black-and-white maid's apron onto my lap as if she were throwing trash into a bin. I looked down at the fabric, my fingers trembling as the weight of her cruelty settled in my chest. This wasn't just about a wedding. This was about my total erasure. Behind her, my sister Azaria stood draped in silk, the literal image of a pampered bride. But it was the man standing behind her who made my stomach turn. Brooks, my ex-boyfriend, had his hand possessively on Azaria's waist. He didn't look away. Instead, he let out a slow, mocking smirk that told me he enjoyed seeing me reduced to this. "We figured it would be a win-win," Brooks added, his voice smooth and devoid of any remorse. "You need the work since you're still struggling, and we need someone we can trust to handle the appetizers without complaining about the pay." My name is Marable, and in that moment, the last flickering candle of love I held for my family was snuffed out. For years, I had been the fixer. I was the one who worked double shifts to pay for Azaria's tuition and covered my parents' mounting credit card debts while I lived on ramen and hope. I had sacrificed my own dreams of finishing my coding degree just to keep their heads above water. Now, they weren't just asking me to watch my ex-boyfriend marry my sister. They were demanding I serve them while they did it. They wanted to see me in a uniform, carrying trays of champagne to people who used to know me as an equal. They didn't just dislike me. They wanted to bury me under the weight of their own perceived superiority. As I clutched the rough apron, I realized that if I didn't find a way to stand up now, I would be their servant for the rest of my life. But as my mother turned her back to me to fuss over Azaria's veil, she had no idea that I was already keeping a secret that would eventually bring their entire house of cards crashing down. The memory of the day the floor vanished beneath my feet still haunts me. It was exactly 2 years ago, in a crowded, noisy coffee shop downtown. I remember the smell of burnt espresso and the way the rain streaked against the windows. I was exhausted, having just been laid off from my administrative job an hour earlier due to company downsizing. I had called Brooks, desperate for a shoulder to lean on, thinking he was my partner in every sense of the word. "I can't do this anymore, Marable," Brooks said, not with sadness but with a cold, clinical detachment. He didn't even reach across the table to hold my hand. I stared at him, my voice cracking as I told him about the layoff. "That's exactly the problem," he snapped, his eyes flashing with irritation. "You're stagnant. You're dead weight, and I need a woman who already has a legacy, not someone I have to carry." I felt like I had been slapped. I had supported him for 3 years, even helping him with his business proposals while I neglected my own interests. And now, at my lowest point, he was discarding me like a piece of broken equipment. "You're lacking ambition," he continued, standing up and adjusted his expensive watch, a watch I had helped him pay for. "I'm moving on to bigger things. Don't call me." He walked out without looking back, leaving me sitting there with a cold cup of coffee and a shattered heart. I went back to my parents' house, hoping for some semblance of comfort, but they were already obsessed with Azaria's rising social media following. When I told them Brooks had left me, my mother didn't offer a hug. She simply sighed and asked if I could still afford to pay the internet bill that month. I was alone, unemployed, and deemed worthless by the people who were supposed to love me most. I spent that night on the floor of my childhood bedroom, crying until my eyes were swollen shut. I thought that was the end of my story. I didn't realize it was actually the prologue to a life they couldn't even imagine. Life after Brooks was a blur of exhaustion. I took every odd job I could find, eventually landing a grueling night shift at a 24-hour diner near the tech district. It was soul-crushing work, but it paid the bills and allowed me to keep my laptop open during my breaks so I could keep practicing my coding. That was where I met Elijah. He was a regular who always came in around 3:00 a.m. He was quiet, dressed in simple hoodies and jeans, and usually sat in the corner booth with a tablet and a notebook. Unlike the other patrons who treated me like a vending machine, he always said please and thank you. One night, he noticed the lines of code on my screen while I was refilling his coffee. "That's a clean solution for a complex data structure," he said, his voice deep and filled with a strange, quiet intensity. I was startled. Most people just saw a waitress. He saw a programmer. We started talking, first about Python and C++, then about life and our dreams. He told me he worked in tech consulting, and I told him about my desire to build something that mattered. Elijah didn't talk about money, but there was an air of authority about him that was impossible to ignore. He began to stay later, waiting until my shift ended just to walk me to my bus stop. He was the first person in years who valued my brilliance over my bank account. He listened when I talked about the way my family treated me, his jaw tightening whenever I mentioned their latest demands. "You're a lioness being told you're a mouse," he said one morning as the sun began to peek over the horizon. "One day, they're going to hear you roar." I didn't know then that Elijah was more than just a tech enthusiast. He was a visionary who had built an empire from nothing, a man who chose to stay hidden from the world's vanity. And for some reason, he had chosen to see me. Elijah and I didn't have a loud, flashy romance. It was built on late-night conversations and a shared understanding of what it meant to be underestimated. 6 months after we met, he took me to a quiet park and told me the truth about his life. The consulting was actually a multi-billion-dollar tech conglomerate he had founded. I was stunned, but it didn't change how I felt. If anything, it made me admire him more because he had remained so grounded. When he asked me to marry him, he didn't promise me fame, he promised me peace. We decided to marry in a private, breathtaking ceremony in Tuscany, Italy. There were no cameras, no influencers, and certainly no members of my toxic family. "I want to keep this off the grid," I told him as we stood overlooking the rolling vineyards. "I want to know what it feels like to be loved for Marable, not for a billionaire's last name." Elijah agreed instantly. He knew my family was a group of clout chasers who would try to drain him the moment they found out who he was. We built a private life of luxury and genuine love, kept strictly off social media to protect our sanctuary. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to be the fixer. Elijah encouraged me to finish my degree and even helped me set up a private investment firm where I could manage real estate assets under a maiden name trust. I was becoming a woman of power, but to the rest of the world, and especially to my family, I was still the stagnant girl who had disappeared into the shadows of a low-income life. I was happy, I was at peace, but I knew the peace wouldn't last forever. My family was like a storm on the horizon, and eventually the clouds were going to break. I just didn't expect the storm to have my ex-boyfriend's face. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon. I hadn't spoken to my sister, Azaria, in nearly a year. I was sitting in my sun-drenched home office, reviewing property deeds for the Blackwood estate, a massive property my firm had recently acquired, when her name flashed on my screen. "Marable, finally you pick up," she chirped, not even bothered to ask how I was. "I have the most amazing news, I'm getting married." I felt a pang of old habit, the urge to be happy for her, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of dread. "That's great, Azaria," I said cautiously. "Who is the lucky guy?" "Oh, you know him," she giggled, a sound that felt like sandpaper on my nerves. "It's Brooks. Can you believe it? He's a successful businessman now, making absolute bank in crypto. He realized he needed someone with real ambition, someone who matches his energy." The air left my lungs. Brooks, the man who had dumped me when I was down, was now marrying my sister and using the same insults he'd hurled at me to praise her. "He's changed so much, Marable," she continued, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "He actually felt bad for you, you know? He said you just didn't have what it took to stay by his side while he climbed the ladder. But don't worry. We're still going to include you in the wedding. We know how much you must be struggling." She didn't wait for me to respond before she started listing the guest list and the expensive flowers she wanted. She was bragging about marrying the man who broke me, and she was doing it with a smile on her face. I realized then that this wasn't just a wedding, it was a victory lap. She wanted me to witness her win, while I remained the family's designated loser. I ended the call with my heart pounding, looking at the wedding ring on my finger that cost more than Brooks' entire crypto portfolio. The game had officially begun. A few days later, my parents reached out. They wanted to have a family lunch to celebrate the engagement. Against my better judgment, I agreed, curious to see how deep the delusion ran. We met at a high-end bistro downtown, a place I knew they couldn't afford on my father's meager pension. The moment I sat down, the air was thick with tension. My mother was wearing a new designer scarf that I suspected was fake, and my father was checking his phone every 5 seconds as if he were a busy executive. "Marable, darling, you look tired," my mother said, looking at my simple, unbranded linen dress. She didn't realize it was custom-made and cost 3 times her rent. "We're just so proud of Azaria," my father boomed, loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "Brooks is a godsend. He's buying us a new house with his crypto millions. He says he wants us to live in luxury, the way we deserve." I took a sip of water, trying to hide the irony. I knew for a fact that Brooks' business was a series of failing startups and questionable investments. When the bill came, the atmosphere shifted instantly. My father didn't even reach for his wallet. Instead, they all looked at me with expectant, slightly annoyed expressions. "You've got this, right, Marable?" my mother asked, her tone shifting from fake nice to demanding. "Since you don't have a family of your own to support, it's only fair you help us out. Brooks says we need to start acting like the elite, and elite people have their children handle the small stuff." I paid the bill without a word, watching them gush about Brooks while I signed the receipt. They were treating me like an ATM while praising the man who was essentially a stranger to them. They were so blinded by the promise of gold that they couldn't see the person who had actually been providing the silver all these years. As we walked out, I saw Brooks' car pull up, a rented luxury sedan, and I knew exactly what kind of businessman he really was. The wedding planning was in full swing, but there was one major problem that Azaria couldn't stop crying about. "It's a disaster, Marable," she wailed over the phone. "The Blackwood estate is fully booked for the next 2 years. It's the only venue in the state that's prestigious enough for Brooks' colleagues." I sat in my office at the investment firm, looking at the master calendar for the Blackwood estate. I was the sole trustee of the firm that owned it. I could see the request from Azaria Miller sitting in the pending folder, marked as denied due to a lack of proper references and a failed credit check on the groom. "I don't know what to do," Azaria continued. "Brooks says if we can't get Blackwood, we might as well get married in a barn. My life is over." I stayed silent, the irony of the situation nearly making me laugh aloud. I could have made one phone call and secured the venue for her in seconds. I could have given her the dream she so desperately craved. But then I remembered the way she laughed when Brooks dumped me. I remembered the maid's apron my mother had already started mentioning. They didn't want my help. They wanted to use me. "I'm sure something will work out, Azaria," I said calmly. A few days later, a miracle happened. The estate manager, acting on my secret instructions, contacted Azaria and told her there had been a cancellation. The truth was, I had authorized the booking myself, but with a very specific set of conditions hidden in the fine print of the contract, conditions that only the owner could trigger. I wanted them at that estate. I wanted them on my home turf, where every waiter, every security guard, and every brick in the wall answered to me. They thought they were renting a dream. They were actually walking into a trap of their own making. The audacity of Brooks never ceased to amaze me. 2 weeks before the wedding, he called me privately. I hadn't spoken to him one-on-one since the day he left me in that coffee shop. "Marable, look," he began, his voice dropping into that fake earnest tone he used when he wanted something. "I'm calling as a friend. I know the family is insisting you come to the wedding, but I think it's a bad idea." I leaned back in my chair, fascinated by his nerve. "Oh, and why is that, Brooks?" "Let be real," he said, and I could practically hear the smirk. "This is going to be a high-profile event. There will be investors there, people with real money. Your poverty and your lack of polish. It's going to stand out. I don't want you ruining Azaria's photos or making things awkward for my guests." He was warning me to stay away because I wasn't classy enough for his fake billionaire lifestyle. He truly believed that in 2 years, I had accomplished nothing while he had conquered the world. He had no idea that the investors he was so worried about were people I had dinner with on a regular basis. "I appreciate the concern, Brooks," I said, my voice as smooth as glass. "But the family has been very insistent. I think it's important I'm there to see the legacy you've built." "Fine," he snapped, "but don't say I didn't warn you when you're sitting in the back row feeling out of place." I hung up and looked at the invitation on my desk. I wasn't going to sit in the back row. I was going to be the one who decided if the show even went on. I decided right then. I was going to that wedding, and I was going to bring the truth with me. My mother, never one to miss an opportunity to humiliate me, sent over a formal contract for my participation in the wedding. It wasn't an invitation. It was a list of terms of service. I could attend, it stated, only if I agreed to work the catering line and assist the cleaning crew after the reception. "We need to save costs, Maribel," she told me when I called to discuss it. "And since you're family, you should be happy to help for free. It'll give you a chance to see how the other half lives." She actually thought she was doing me a favor by letting me scrub floors at my sister's wedding. I read through the contract. It was insulting, petty, and perfectly reflected the people who raised me. I picked up a pen and signed it with a smile. I knew something they didn't. The owner's suite at the Blackwood estate was already being prepared for my arrival. The staff had been briefed that a VIP guest would be staying there, but their identity was to remain strictly confidential. Elijah watched me as I folded the contract. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" he asked, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. "We could just buy the debt out from under them today and end it." "No," I said, leaning my head back against him. "They need to see it. They need to understand that the person they tried to bury is the one who owns the ground they're standing on." Elijah nodded, his eyes reflecting a fierce pride. "Then we do it your way. I'll arrive separately. Give them the performance they're asking for, and I'll be there to provide the finale." I signed the terms of service and mailed it back. I was going to be the best maid they ever had, right up until I became their worst nightmare. The morning of the wedding arrived with a crisp, clear sky. To maintain the ruse, I didn't take a limousine or even my own luxury SUV. I hailed a beat-up, yellow taxi and had the driver drop me off at the main gates of the Blackwood estate. I was dressed in a simple, faded t-shirt and jeans, carrying a small bag with the maid's apron tucked inside. As I walked up the long, winding driveway, I saw the expensive cars of the guests beginning to arrive: Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and Porsches. I recognized some of the drivers. They were colleagues of Elijah's who would be very confused to see me like this. I kept my head down, making sure my hair covered my face. When I reached the main entrance, my mother was barking orders at a florist. She spotted me and her face twisted in a mixture of embarrassment and triumph. "There you are! You're late!" she hissed, grabbing my arm and pulling me away from the front steps. "Don't just stand there where people can see you. Use the kitchen entrance." She pointed toward the back of the house, where the service staff was unloading crates of food. "And put that apron on immediately. If I see you talking to any of the guests, I'll have security kick you out." I followed her directions, feeling the eyes of a few guests on me. I heard a girl, one of Azaria's bridesmaids, whisper, "Is that her sister? She looks like a vagrant." I didn't flinch. I walked through the kitchen where the staff immediately froze. The head chef started to bow, but I gave him a sharp, subtle shake of my head. He understood the assignment. I went into the small staff changing room, put on the black and white apron, and stepped out into the fray. For the next 3 hours, I was invisible. I carried trays of hors d'oeuvres, refilled water glasses, and wiped down tables, all while my family pointedly ignored me as if I were a ghost in a uniform. I was waiting for the right moment, and that moment was coming faster than any of them realized. Being invisible has its advantages. As I moved through the crowds with my tray of appetizers, people spoke freely, assuming the help was either deaf or too unimportant to matter. I was clearing empty glasses near the groom's suite when I heard voices coming from behind the heavy oak door. It was Brooks and Azaria, and they weren't sounding like a happy couple. "I'm telling you, Azaria, we need that inheritance money now," Brooks hissed, his voice tight with anxiety. "The crypto accounts are frozen, and the investors are starting to ask questions I can't answer." "What do you mean, frozen?" Azaria's voice was high and panicked. "You told my parents you were buying them a house. You told me we were set for life." "I said that so your father would sign over the deed to his property as collateral for my new venture," Brooks snapped. "I thought the old man had a hidden stash of cash or some offshore accounts he wasn't telling anyone about. That's the only reason I went through with this wedding. If he's as broke as Marable, we're in serious trouble. I stood perfectly still, my hand gripping the tray. They were both scammers. Brooks didn't love Azaria. He was trying to harvest a family fortune that didn't exist. And Azaria didn't love Brooks. She just loved the image of the life he promised. They were two vultures trying to pick the bones of a skeleton. "We just have to get through today," Azaria said, her voice dropping to a low, desperate whisper. "Once the photos are out and we look like royalty, we can figure out how to squeeze the rest of the family or find a new angel investor." I walked away quietly, my heart cold. They were planning to ruin my parents just to fund their fake lifestyle. My family was toxic, but Brooks was a predator. I had heard enough. The charity part of this evening was officially over. The ceremony was less than an hour away, and the tension in the air was palpable. I was heading back toward the kitchen when Azaria intercepted me in the hallway. She looked stunning in her white gown, but her expression was anything but angelic. She was holding a glass of full-bodied red wine, and as I tried to pass her, she stumbled. The dark liquid splashed across the front of my white apron and soaked into my shirt. "Oh, my goodness, Marable, I am so sorry," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern, though she couldn't hide the nasty glint in her eyes. "I'm just so nervous. But honestly," she leaned in, her voice dropping to a cruel whisper, "you look better with stains. It matches your life." She and a nearby bridesmaid broke into peals of laughter. "You should probably go hide in the basement now," the bridesmaid added. "We wouldn't want the maid looking messy for the ceremony." I looked down at the red stains spreading across my chest. I didn't get angry. I didn't scream. Instead, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. This was the final push I needed. "You're right, Azaria," I said, looking her directly in the eye. "I do need to change. This look doesn't suit me at all." "Good girl," she patted my cheek dismissively. "Go find some rags in the back. Just make sure you're ready to serve the champagne during the toasts." I turned and walked away, but I didn't head for the kitchen or the basement. I walked straight to the grand elevators and swiped a black keycard that no staff member was supposed to have. I was heading to the owner's suite, and I was about to shed the skin of the victim forever. Inside the owner's suite, the air was cool and smelled of fresh lilies. I stripped off the stained apron and the cheap shirt, throwing them into the trash can without a second thought. My personal assistant, who had arrived hours ago, was waiting for me with a garment bag. "Is everything ready, Mrs. Elijah?" she asked softly. "Everything," I replied. I stepped into a custom-made, $50,000 silk gown the color of midnight. It fit me like a second skin, elegant and powerful. I put on the diamond necklace Elijah had given me for our anniversary, a piece so rare it didn't even have a public price tag. I did my makeup with precision, transforming the tired Marable into a woman who commanded the room. Suddenly, the sound of rotors thrummed through the air. I walked to the window and saw a sleek, black helicopter descending onto the private helipad at the back of the property. The door opened, and Elijah stepped out, looking like royalty in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. He looked up at my window and gave a small, knowing nod. "It's time," I whispered to my reflection. Downstairs, the music was starting. The guests were taking their seats, and my family was preparing for their moment of glory. They thought they were about to crown themselves as the new elite. They had no idea that the queen was already in the building, and she was done playing nice. I took one last look at the maid I used to be and walked out the door, my heels clicking with a rhythm of pure, unadulterated justice. The wedding ceremony was about to begin. The guests were all seated in the grand ballroom, their heads turned toward the altar where Brooks stood, looking nervous but triumphant. My mother and father were in the front row, beaming with a pride they had never once shown me. The string quartet began to play a soft, romantic melody, signaling the entrance of the bride. But instead of the bride appearing at the back of the aisle, a hush fell over the room as I appeared at the top of the grand marble staircase. I didn't rush. I walked down the stairs with a slow, deliberate grace, my midnight blue gown flowing behind me like a shadow. The music faltered and then stopped altogether as the quartet realized something was very wrong. The guests began to whisper, the sound rising like a tide. "Who is that?" I heard someone ask. Is that a celebrity? Another whispered. I saw my mother's face first. Her jaw dropped, and her eyes widened in total confusion. She recognized me, but her brain couldn't reconcile the maid she had just seen with the goddess walking down the stairs. My father looked equally stunned, his face turning a shade of pale that I had never seen before. I reached the bottom of the stairs just as Elijah stepped into the ballroom from the side entrance. He didn't go to a seat. He walked straight to the center of the room, meeting me halfway. He took my hand and kissed it, his eyes never leaving mine. The silence in the room was so thick you could hear a pin drop. The charity case had just arrived, and the entire wedding was suddenly secondary to the woman in the midnight dress. The silence was broken by my mother, who couldn't contain her rage any longer. She stood up, her face flushed with embarrassment as she marched toward me. "Maribel, what on earth do you think you're doing?" she hissed, reaching out to grab my arm and drag me away from the center of the room. "You're supposed to be in the kitchen. Where did you steal that dress? You're ruining everything." Elijah stepped forward before she could touch me, his presence like a wall of ice. "I would suggest you take your hand back, madam," he said, his voice low and dangerous. My mother froze. She looked at Elijah, her eyes darting from his expensive tuxedo to the cold authority in his gaze. She didn't recognize him at first, but Brooks did. I looked toward the altar. Brooks' face had gone from triumphant to a ghostly, terrified white. He was staring at Elijah as if he were seeing a ghost. He knew exactly who Elijah was, the world-famous tech titan whose shoes Brooks wasn't fit to shine. Brooks literally stumbled back a step, his hand gripping the altar for support. "Elijah," Brooks stammered, his voice cracking. What are you doing here?" Azaria appeared in the doorway then, her face a mask of confusion and fury. "Brooks, what's going on? Who is this woman and why is she in my dress?" she shrieked, pointing at me. "That woman is my wife," Elijah said, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom. "And she is the reason you are all standing in this room today." The collective gasp from the guests was deafening. My mother's hand dropped to her side as she looked between me and Elijah, her mind clearly spinning. The daughter she had treated like a servant was married to the man her successful son-in-law was terrified of. The power shift was instantaneous, and the look of pure terror on Brooks' face was, as I had imagined, absolutely priceless. Brooks tried to recover, though his voice was shaking so hard he could barely get the words out. "Maribel, your husband," he asked, looking at me with a desperate, pathetic hope that this was all a joke. "But you were. I mean, what are you doing in this woman's dress? This is a high-profile event, you can't just—" "I'm not in this woman's dress, Brooks," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I'm in my own. And as for what I'm doing here, I believe I'm here to fulfill my terms of service." Azaria marched down the aisle, her face contorted with rage. "I don't care who he is. This is my wedding. Security, get this crazy woman and her husband out of here." She looked toward the back of the room, expecting the estate security to come running. But instead of moving toward me, the security team stood perfectly still, their arms crossed. Then, the venue manager, a man Azaria had been hounding for weeks, walked out from the shadows. He didn't look at Azaria. He walked straight to me and bowed deeply. "Mrs. Elijah," he said, his voice clear and respectful. "The staff is ready for your orders. We've cleared the kitchen as you requested." The room went cold. My mother's face turned a ghostly, sickly white. My father actually had to sit back down. "Orders," Azaria whispered, her voice trembling. "What do you mean, orders?" "It means, Azaria," I said, stepping closer to her until we were eye to eye, "that while you were busy trying to make me your maid, you forgot to check who actually owns the Blackwood estate. I am the sole trustee of the firm you've been begging for a cancellation from. This isn't just a venue. It's my property." The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had been mocking the woman who held her entire dream wedding in the palm of her hand. The atmosphere in the room shifted from shock to a desperate, nauseating pivot. My mother, seeing the power had completely left her hands, suddenly forced a bright, trembling smile onto her face. She stepped toward the guests, clapping her hands as if this were all a planned surprise. "Oh, did you hear that? My wonderful Marable. I always knew she was destined for greatness, she chirped, her voice pitching up an octave. I was just telling everyone how hard she worked because I knew she'd find a king like Elijah. We were just testing her, weren't we, dear? A little family joke to keep her humble before her big reveal. She tried to reach out and pat my shoulder, her eyes pleading with me to play along so she wouldn't lose face in front of the wealthy guests. Isn't she just stunning? Our Marable, the billionaire's wife. We are so blessed. I didn't let her finish. I stepped back, cutting her off mid-sentence with a look so cold it seemed to freeze the air between us. Stop it, mother, I said, my voice low and sharp. The test is over, and you failed it the moment you tossed that apron at me. The guests were now murmuring, but the tone had changed. They weren't whispering about the maid anymore. They were whispering about the cruelty of a family that would treat their own daughter like a servant while she was secretly their benefactor. But Marable, darling, my father started, standing up and trying to look dignified. No, I said, turning my back on them. I walked toward the front of the room, where the microphone for the toasts was already set up. I didn't need a ceremony. I needed to deliver the truth. I picked up the microphone, the feedback echoing through the silent room. It was time for the toast of a lifetime. Thank you all for being here, I began, my voice amplified and steady throughout the ballroom. I know you were all expecting a wedding, but I think it's important we celebrate something else tonight. The truth. I looked over at Brooks and Azaria, who were standing like statues at the altar. I want to thank the happy couple for showing me exactly what I escaped from 2 years ago, I said, watching Brooks flinch. Brooks, thank you for leaving me when I was at my lowest. You taught me that I didn't need dead weight like you to build a legacy. The guests gasped, and some of the investors Brooks had been trying to impress started looking at him with newfound suspicion. And Azaria, I continued, turning to my sister, thank you for reminding me that family is about more than just a last name. You wanted a servant for your wedding, and I was happy to oblige. I've been serving you all my life, haven't I? Paying your tuition, covering your debts, fixing your messes. Marable, stop this, my mother shouted from the front row. I'm just serving the truth, Mother, just like I promised, I replied calmly. But since we're talking about legacies and successful businessmen, I have a little gift for the groom and my parents. Something to help them start their new life in the house, Brooks promised them. I reached into my gown and pulled out a single, folded document. I saw Brooks' eyes fixate on it, his face turning from white to a deep, panicked red. He knew what was in my hand. He knew the crypto millions were about to meet the reality of a real bank. You see, I said, holding up the document so the guests could see the official bank seal. Brooks told my parents he was buying them a luxury home as a wedding gift. He even had them sign some papers for the loan. What he didn't tell them was that the loan was being issued by a boutique bank that specializes in high-risk investments. I paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in. A bank that Elijah happens to own. A collective "oh" rippled through the room. Brooks looked like he was about to faint. I reviewed the application this morning, I continued. It turns out the loan was just denied, not just because of lack of collateral, but for blatant fraud. Brooks, you tried to use my father's house, the one I've been paying the taxes on for 5 years, as collateral for a loan you intended to use to pay off your own personal debts. My father gasped, clutching his chest as he looked at Brooks. You said it was a gift. You said we were moving to the coast. He lied to you, I said simply, just like he lied about being a successful businessman. The crypto millions are non-existent. He's been running a shell game, and he was hoping this wedding would buy him enough time to find a new victim. Unfortunately for him, he chose my house to play his game in. Azaria lunged at me then, her silk dress rustling as she screamed. You're lying. You're just jealous. You're ruining my big day because you've always been the mistake sister. I didn't move. I didn't have to. 2 security guards stepped in front of me, blocking her path with professional ease. I looked at her, seeing the desperation and the ugliness that no amount of designer makeup could hide. I'm not the mistake, Azaria, I said quietly. I'm the consequence. The room was in total chaos. Guests were standing up, some trying to leave, others pulling out their phones to record the meltdown. Brooks was backed against the altar, his eyes darting toward the exits, but Elijah's security team had already blocked every door. "Maribel, please," my mother sobbed, her fake smile long gone. "We're family, you can't do this to us. Just tell the bank it was a mistake. Give Brooks the money to fix this, and we can all go back to being a happy family. You're a billionaire now, what's a few million to you?" I looked at her, and for the first time I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a profound sense of relief. "You're right, Mother," I said. "A few million is nothing to me, but the respect you never gave me, that's something you can't buy." Brooks saw an opening and tried to push past the guards toward me. "Maribel, listen to me," he said, his voice dropping into that low, manipulative tone he thought still worked on me. "I made a mistake. I was scared. I always loved you, Maribel. I only married her because I thought it would help me get back to you. We can leave together right now. We can start over." He reached out a hand, but before he could get close, Elijah appeared behind him like a dark shadow. Elijah didn't even have to say a word. He just stood there, his presence radiating such a cold, crushing power that Brooks literally tripped over his own feet in fear, falling onto the marble floor. "The only thing you're leaving with, Brooks," Elijah said, his voice like grinding stones, "is the police." As if on cue, the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. 4 uniformed officers walked in, their faces grim. They weren't there for the wedding. They were there for the fraudster at the altar. The lead officer walked straight to Brooks, who was still scrambled on the floor. "Brooks Miller, you're under arrest for embezzlement, corporate fraud, and identity theft." The room went silent again as the handcuffs clicked into place. "Embezzlement?" Azaria shrieked, her voice reaching a fever pitch. "From where? He's the CEO." "He was a junior analyst who stole company funds to maintain the appearance of being a billionaire," the officer replied, pulling Brooks to his feet. "His firm has been tracking the missing millions for months. They finally traced the last wedding payment to this estate." My mother let out a wail that sounded like a wounded animal. My father just stared at the floor, the realization of his own greed finally sinking in. They had traded their loyal daughter for a criminal in a rented suit. "Maribel, you have to help him." Azaria turned on me, her eyes wild. "If he goes to jail, I'll be ruined. My reputation, my life." "You were ruined the moment you decided that hurting me was worth more than being a sister," I said. "I'm not the fixer anymore, Azaria. I'm the owner." I turned to the venue manager. "The contract for this event is voided due to the illegal nature of the funds used to pay for it," I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Please escort the wedding party off the premises immediately." "But Maribel," my mother cried as a security guard took her arm. "Where are we supposed to go?" "I hear there's a lovely bench in the park near that coffee shop where Brooks dumped me," I said, my voice as cold as the Tussian winter. "Maybe you can find some legacy there." The guests watched in stunned silence as my family was escorted out of the ballroom. Azaria was still screaming, her white dress trailing on the floor as she was led away. My mother was begging anyone who would listen, and my father walked with his head down, finally looking like the old man he was. Brooks was marched out in handcuffs, his legacy ending in the back of a police cruiser. Once they were gone, I turned back to the room. The guests were looking at me with a mixture of awe and fear. These were the people who had spent the afternoon ignoring the maid. "The reception is officially over," I said into the microphone. "But since the food and wine are already paid for, by me, I suggest you all enjoy the rest of the evening. Just remember, when you look at the help in the future, make sure you know who they really are." I handed the microphone back to the manager and walked toward Elijah. He took my hand, his grip warm and steady. "Are you okay?" he whispered. "I've never been better," I said, and I meant it. The weight I had been carrying for 25 years, the weight of their expectations, their cruelty, and their greed, had finally been lifted. I felt light. I felt powerful. We walked out of the ballroom, leaving the whispers and the wreckage of the wedding behind us. We didn't go to the helicopter. We went to the balcony of the owner's suite, overlooking the sprawling gardens of the estate. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. "You did it," Elijah said, standing behind me and wrapping his arms around my waist. "No," I said, leaning back against him. "We did it, and now, for the first time, I don't have to look back." The aftermath was swift and brutal for the Millers. Within 24 hours, the story of the Billionaire's maid had gone viral. The news of Brooke's arrest was on every local channel, and the Crypto King was revealed to be nothing more than a mid-level thief. I sat in my office at the firm, watching the news reports. My phone was buzzing incessantly with messages from friends and distant relatives who were suddenly very interested in my life. I didn't answer a single one. I had already instructed my team to change my personal number and block any incoming calls from my family. My parents lost everything. Since they had signed over their house as collateral for Brooke's fraudulent loan, my bank, had every right to seize it. I didn't leave them homeless, though. I wasn't that cruel. I had my firm purchase a small 2-bedroom apartment in a modest part of town and told the manager to let them live there, provided they never contacted me again. It was the last fix I would ever do for them. Azaria's influencer career ended overnight. The brands she had been bragging to dropped her immediately, and her social media was flooded with comments calling her out for her treatment of her sister. She was left with a mountain of debt from the wedding dress and the luxury items she had bought on credit, thinking Brooke's was her meal ticket. She sent me one last email, a long, rambling message full of apologies and excuses. I didn't even read the whole thing. I simply hit the delete button. The girl who would have sacrificed everything for them was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her worth, and that worth was far too high to be spent on people who only saw me as a means to an end. A month later, Elijah and I were back at our home in Tuscany. The drama of the wedding felt like a lifetime ago. I was finishing my final projects for my degree, and my investment firm was thriving, focusing on helping young women from disadvantaged backgrounds start their own tech businesses. I was sitting in the garden when Elijah walked out with 2 glasses of wine. "You look peaceful," he said, sitting down beside me. "I am," I said, taking a sip of the crisp white wine. "For the first time in my life, I don't feel like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. I don't feel like I'm responsible for anyone else's happiness but my own." I had deleted their numbers, blocked their social media, and removed every trace of their toxicity from my life. I had realized that the ultimate revenge wasn't the money or the public humiliation I had delivered at the wedding. It wasn't seeing Brooks in handcuffs or Azaria in tears. The ultimate revenge was the peace they could no longer disturb. It was the fact that I could wake up every morning and know that my life was mine, built on my talent, my strength, and a love that didn't require me to be anyone but myself. I looked out over the vineyards, the golden light of the late afternoon sun bathing everything in a warm glow. I had been the fixer, the maid, and the stagnant girl, but now I was just Marable, and Marable was more than enough. "What are you thinking about?" Elijah asked, taking my hand. "I'm thinking about the future," I said, leaning over to kiss him. "And for the first time, it's a future that I'm actually excited to see." We stood on the balcony of our villa, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the Italian sky. The world seemed so big and so full of possibility. I thought about the girl in the coffee shop 2 years ago, the one who thought her life was over because a man didn't see her value. I wished I could go back and tell her that the dead weight Brooks spoke of was actually the wings that would eventually help her fly. I had learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who see you when you're invisible and choose to stand by you when you have nothing. Elijah had been my family long before we signed a marriage license. He had seen the coder in the waitress, the lioness in the mouse. My story had started with a betrayal, but it ended with a transformation. I was no longer defined by the cruelty of the people who raised me or the rejection of a man who didn't deserve me. I was defined by my own resilience. The Millers were a memory now, a cautionary tale of what happens when greed and cruelty are allowed to masquerade as love. They were facing the financial and social consequences of their own choices, while I was walking into a life of true fulfillment. As the night air settled around us, I felt a deep, unshakable sense of justice. I had served the truth, and the truth had set me free. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of jasmine and the sea, knowing that the maid was gone for good. In her place stood a woman who owned her world, her heart, and most importantly, her peace. The ultimate revenge wasn't a moment. It was a life well lived. And as Elijah pulled me closer, I knew that my best chapters were still yet to be written.